She was 14 when the needle first went in. So was he. Both of them children. Both of them black. Both of them already famous. Both of them already being used by men 3 times their age who saw genius and decided to turn it into profit. The heroin was supposed to make the pain stop, to quiet the voices of everyone who'd ever told them their bodies weren't their own. For Etta James, it became a 40-year war she somehow survived, a battle she fought in rehab centers and recording studios and dark hotel rooms across America. For Frankie Lymon, it was a death sentence he never escaped. He was gone by 25. She lived to 73. Same drug, same industry, same trauma. But only one of them learned how to fight back. The question nobody asks is why. Harlem, 1954. Frankie Lymon was 12 years old, standing on a street corner with 4 other boys, singing doo-wop harmonies that made people stop walking. His voice was different. Not just good, impossible. A child's voice that carried adult emotion, a sound that shouldn't exist coming from someone who still had to ask permission to cross the street. Pedestrians would pause mid-step. Strangers would gather in small crowds, and sometimes, on warm summer evenings, windows would open 3 floors up just so people could hear him better. Within 2 years, he'd have the #1 song in America. Within 14, he'd be dead on a bathroom floor with a needle in his arm. Los Angeles, 1954. Etta James was 16, lying about her age, already performing in clubs where grown men watched her with eyes that had nothing to do with music. She'd been discovered at 14, pulled out of choir practice by a man who heard her voice and saw dollar signs. Her voice was raw power, gospel fire wrapped in blues pain, sexuality she was too young to understand being packaged and sold to adults who understood it perfectly. The stage lights were too hot, the dresses were too tight, and the men in the front row were too close, their cigarette smoke curling up toward her like reaching fingers. Within a year, she'd be addicted to heroin. Within 5 decades, she'd still be alive to tell the story. Nobody talks about how similar their beginnings were. Both discovered as children. Both thrust into adult worlds before they understood what adulthood meant. Both surrounded by people who called themselves managers, producers, mentors, but who were really just predators in nice suits. Both black kids in an industry run by white men who knew exactly how much money a young black voice could generate and exactly how little they had to pay for it. Both learned too young that their bodies weren't their own, that their voices belonged to contracts they'd signed before they could read, that fame meant being owned. The industry had different methods for destroying young black talent. Gender just determined which method got used. Frankie's exploitation was financial and identity-based. Morris Levy, the mobster who controlled Roulette Records, saw a 13-year-old with a hit song and made sure Frankie never saw real money from it. The contracts were designed to be incomprehensible to a child. The royalty structures were built to funnel money everywhere except to the artist who created it. Why Do Fools Fall in Love sold over 1 million copies in its first month. Frankie received a few $100s and a pat on the head. The song would generate millions over the decades. Frankie would die owing money to the same people who'd stolen his royalties. Frankie performed. Frankie made millions. Frankie died broke. But the psychological damage went deeper than stolen money. Frankie was a child star, which meant his childhood was a performance. The cute kid with the big voice, the innocent boy singing about love he'd never experienced. The industry needed him to stay young forever, even as his voice was changing, even as he was growing up, even as the thing that made him special was biologically disappearing. At 15, his voice started breaking. At 16, the hits stopped coming. At 17, he was already a has-been, trying to recapture something that puberty had stolen from him. Nobody had prepared him for that. Nobody had told him that his entire value was tied to something he couldn't control. Nobody had explained that child stars have expiration dates. Etta's exploitation was sexual and different. She was discovered by Johnny Otis, who heard her sing at a church talent show and immediately put her on stage in adult clubs. She was 14, wearing dresses that made her look older, singing songs about sex and heartbreak to drunk men who didn't care that she was still a child. The industry loved her voice, but they loved her body too, and nobody saw a problem with that. Harvey Fuqua became her boyfriend when she was 16, and he was in his 20s. He was also her manager, which meant the man who controlled her career was the same man who controlled her body. That wasn't unusual in the industry. That was how it worked. Young black girls with talent got passed around like property, and if you complained, you lost your career. The message was clear. Your voice makes us money. Your body is part of the package. If you want to keep singing, you don't say no. Etta learned to survive that, but the survival tools she developed came with their own cost. The heroin started the same way for both of them. For Frankie, it was 1961. He was 17. His career was collapsing, his voice was gone, and he was still legally bound to contracts that demanded performances he couldn't deliver anymore. The stage that had loved him had moved on to the next thing. He was yesterday's news at an age when most people are just starting their lives. The heroin made the silence stop screaming in his head. It made him feel like he mattered again. It made him forget, for a few hours, that he was a has-been before he'd even learned how to be a person. For Etta, it was around the same time, maybe 1960, maybe earlier. She was 18, 19, already exhausted from years of being used. The heroin helped her perform when she was tired, helped her not feel what was being done to her, helped her become the version of Etta James that everyone wanted, the one who could sing all night and never complain and always be available. The drug promised escape. It delivered a different kind of prison. But here's where the stories split. Here's where the same starting point led to completely different endings. Frankie never learned he could fight back. He was too young when fame hit. He'd been raised to be obedient, to perform on command, to believe that adults knew what was best for him. Even as those adults stole from him, even as they destroyed him, he never developed the tools to say no. He'd been a product since age 13. He didn't know how to be anything else. When interviewers asked him about his plans, he could only talk about the next performance, the next song, the next thing someone else had scheduled for him. He had no language for his own desires because nobody had ever asked him what he wanted. When the heroin took over, he had no defense system. No one had ever taught him he had value beyond his voice. No one had ever told him he deserved better. No one had ever modeled what fighting back looked like. He just kept falling. Etta was different. Not because she was stronger, not because she was smarter, but because she got angry. Somewhere in her early 20s, after years of being controlled by Harvey Fuqua, after years of watching white artists get rich off songs she'd made famous, after years of being used and discarded and used again, Etta James learned to hate the people who'd done this to her. And that hate became a weapon. She started fighting back. Not perfectly, not always successfully, but she fought. When Chess Records tried to control her music, she fought for creative input. When Harvey Fuqua tried to control her money, she eventually left him. When the industry tried to define who Etta James was supposed to be, she started defining herself. She'd walk out of recording sessions if she didn't like the material. She'd cancel shows if promoters tried to cheat her. She learned to read contracts slowly, painfully, teaching herself the legal language designed to confuse her. The gospel girl, the blues woman, the rock and roll screamer, the jazz singer. She refused to be just one thing, refused to be packaged, refused to stay in the box they'd built for her. The addiction didn't stop. The trauma didn't disappear. But she'd learned something Frankie never got the chance to learn. She learned she could fight. Frankie Lymon died on February 27, 1968. He was 25 years old. His grandmother found him on the bathroom floor of her apartment in Harlem, a needle still in his arm. He'd been trying to make a comeback. He'd been performing in small clubs, trying to recapture something that couldn't be recaptured. He'd been married 3 times to women who loved the memory of who he used to be. He died broke, forgotten by an industry that had made millions off his voice. The obituaries barely mentioned him. There was no state funeral, no industry tribute, no outpouring of grief from the people who'd used him. He was buried in an unmarked grave because there wasn't enough money for a headstone. The boy who'd sung to millions died alone and disappeared into silence. That should have been Etta's story, too. By 1974, Etta James was deep in addiction. Heroin had taken over completely. She was missing shows, burning bridges, destroying relationships. Chess records had dropped her. Her career was in free fall. She was doing the same thing Frankie had done, disappearing into the drug, using it to escape a life that had become unbearable. But something different happened. She hit bottom, but she didn't die there. In 1974, at rock bottom, Etta checked herself into rehab. Not because the industry forced her, not because a manager decided she was worth saving, because she decided she wanted to live. It took multiple tries. She relapsed. She went back. She relapsed again. The battle with heroin lasted decades, not months. But she kept fighting. And here's what made the difference. Etta James started telling her story. She wrote an autobiography, Rage to Survive, where she described everything: the sexual abuse, the exploitation, the drugs, the pain. She didn't sanitize it. She didn't make it pretty. She told the truth about what the industry had done to her, and in telling it, she took back power. Frankie never got that chance. He died before he could speak. His story was told by the people who'd exploited him, shaped by the industry that had destroyed him. He became a cautionary tale, a tragedy, a sad footnote in rock and roll history. Etta became a survivor who refused to be silent. She kept performing into her 70s. Her voice, damaged by decades of drugs and cigarettes, somehow became more powerful with age. The pain in her voice wasn't performed anymore. It was real, earned, survived. When she sang "I'd Rather Go Blind" at 70 years old, everyone in the room could hear every year she'd fought to stay alive. In 2012, Etta James died at 73, not from an overdose, from leukemia, surrounded by family, having lived long enough to see herself inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, to win 6 Grammys, to have her music celebrated by generations who didn't know the full story of what she'd survived. She died in a hospital bed, holding her son's hands, lucid enough to say goodbye, wealthy enough to leave them something besides trauma. Her funeral was attended by hundreds. Stevie Wonder sang. Christina Aguilera performed. The industry that had tried to destroy her showed up to mourn her, and the bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the real story. But she'd lived long enough to control her narrative. That was the victory Frankie never got. The question that haunts both stories is simple. Why did Etta survive and Frankie didn't? The easy answer is that addiction affects everyone differently, that some people are stronger, that luck plays a role. But that's not the whole truth. The real difference was age and awareness. Frankie was exploited starting at 13, when his brain was still forming, when his identity was still developing. He never had a chance to become a person separate from Frankie Lymon, the star. By the time he was old enough to understand what had been done to him, the damage was complete. He didn't have the psychological tools to fight back, because those tools are built during the teenage years he'd spent performing instead of growing. Etta was exploited starting at 14, just 1 year older, but that 1 year mattered. She'd had slightly more time to develop a sense of self before the industry got hold of her. Not much more. Just enough that when they tried to break her completely, there was something left inside that remembered who she'd been before fame. And she got angry. That anger saved her life. Frankie never got angry. He got sad. He got lost. He got high. But he never developed the rage that could have fueled a fight. He'd been trained too young to be compliant, to perform, to please. That compliance killed him. Etta's rage kept her alive long enough to find help. There's another difference that nobody talks about. Gender gave Etta different survival tools, even as it made her exploitation more violent. As a woman in the industry, Etta was forced to develop defensive strategies. She had to learn to navigate sexual predators, to create boundaries, to fight off men who thought her body came with her voice. Those survival skills, brutal as they were to develop, taught her how to fight. Frankie, as a male child star, was exploited financially and psychologically, but he wasn't taught that the world was trying to harm him in the same way. He was taught to trust the adults around him, to believe that managers and producers had his best interests at heart. By the time he realized they didn't, he was already destroyed. The industry broke them both. But it gave Etta the awareness that she was being broken, and that awareness eventually became her weapon. In the end, both stories are about the same thing. What happens to children when adults decide their talent is worth more than their humanity? What happens when the industry values the product over the person? What happens when fame comes before the brain is ready to process what fame means? Frankie Lymon's story is a tragedy because it didn't have to end that way. If someone had protected him, if someone had cared about him more than his voice, if someone had taught him he had value beyond what he could produce, if the industry had seen him as a child instead of a commodity. But nobody did. Etta James's story is a miracle because she survived despite everything designed to kill her. The sexual abuse, the financial exploitation, the heroin, the industry's complete disregard for her humanity. She survived because somewhere, deep inside, she found the rage to fight back and the courage to keep fighting even when she kept losing. 2 children, 2 geniuses, 2 addicts. One died at 25, alone, broke, forgotten. One lived to 73, celebrated, heard, survived. The difference wasn't talent. They were both impossibly gifted. The difference wasn't the drugs. They both used the same poison. The difference was that Etta James learned something Frankie Lymon never got the chance to learn. That surviving meant fighting. That fighting meant getting angry. That getting angry meant refusing to let the people who broke you write the ending to your story. Frankie Lymon never learned he could say no. Etta James learned it late, but she learned it hard. And that made all the difference between a grave nobody visited and a legacy nobody could erase. Some voices survive their trauma, some don't. The ones that make it aren't always the strongest. Sometimes they're just the ones who got angry enough to fight for one more day, one more year, one more chance to tell the truth about what happened to them. Etta James fought for 50 years after the heroin started. Frankie Lymon fought for 8. Both battles mattered. Both stories deserved to be told. But only one of them survived to tell it themselves.